Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into the Articles of Confederation.
Okay.
America's first attempt at a unified government.
Yeah.
After breaking free from British rule.
Right.
We're going to be looking at this as a story of founding failures, because sometimes you learn more from what didn't work.
That's a fascinating take. It's almost like looking at the rough draft of the Constitution.
Right.
By understanding the shortcomings of the Articles, we can really appreciate the successes of the U.S. government system that we have today.
Exactly. Imagine trying to run a country with no president, like no courts.
Wow.
It sounds chaotic, but that's exactly what the Articles attempted.
Yeah.
So let's set the stage. It's the 1770s.
Okay.
The Revolutionary War is raging, and the 13 colonies are trying to figure out how to govern themselves.
They need some rules.
Right. So they draft the Articles of the Confederation, but get this, it takes them a whopping 4 years to get all the states on board.
Ooh, that right there speaks volumes. It hints at the deep-rooted disagreements and foreshadows that ongoing tension between states' rights and federal power that would continue to shape American politics.
Right. Not exactly a smooth start.
Yeah.
So the Articles established a Confederate system, which means the states held most of the power.
Yeah, think about the context here. The colonists were terrified of a powerful central authority after their experience with British rule.
Of course.
So they intentionally created a system where the states retained most of the power. How do you think this fear kind of manifested in the Articles?
Well, I'm guessing they were pretty hesitant to give the national government much control at all.
You got it. The government under the Articles consisted of a unicameral legislature.
Oh,
just one legislative body with each state getting one vote regardless of its size or population.
Hold on. So no president, no courts.
Nope. No independent executive or judicial branches like we have today. Instead, temporary officers were appointed by Congress to carry out some of those functions. George Washington himself described the Articles as creating a half-starved, limping government that appears to be always moving upon crutches and tottering at every step.
Ouch. That's not exactly a ringing endorsement.
No, it's not.
And I bet getting anything done was a nightmare.
Absolutely. Major decisions required a unanimous vote from all 13 states. Essentially, each state had veto power, making it incredibly difficult to pass any meaningful legislation.
Okay, let's unpack the practical consequences of this half-starved government. The Articles couldn't regulate commerce between states, establish a national currency, or even tax the people directly.
This meant the government was powerless to address critical issues. Imagine, states were slapping tariffs on each other's goods, creating economic chaos. It was like 13 mini-countries operating independently.
That sounds disastrous.
Right.
And weren't they also deeply in debt from the Revolutionary War?
Right. They had no way to raise revenue and were completely reliant on states to voluntarily contribute funds. As you can imagine, that didn't always happen. This brings us to one of the most striking examples of the Articles' failure. Shays' Rebellion.
Ah, yes. Shays' Rebellion.
Yeah.
This wasn't just some minor protest. This was a full-blown armed uprising in Massachusetts, led by disgruntled farmers. They were facing economic hardship and felt the state government wasn't doing enough to help them.
And the national government, with no standing army, was utterly helpless. It relied entirely on the states to put down the rebellion, exposing the fragility of the entire system.
Wow.
Shays' Rebellion was a wake-up call for many, highlighting that the Articles couldn't handle the challenges facing the nation. It also revealed a deeper problem. The Articles' lack of any real system for upholding the rule of law, or a clear, enforceable framework for governance, what we call constitutionalism.
It's mind-boggling to think about how different things were back then. It seems like they were missing some pretty basic principles we take for granted today.
Yeah.
Checks and balances, separation of powers.
Right. These concepts were revolutionary at the time and were born out of the failures of the Articles.
Okay.
The framers wanted to create a more stable and effective government, so they needed a way to prevent any one person or group from having too much power. What do you think? How do checks and balances work in our government today, and how does that contrast with the system under the Articles?
Well, today we have 3 branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial, each with its own powers and responsibilities.
Right.
And they're designed to keep each other in check. Right. So no one branch can become too powerful.
Exactly. It's like a 3-legged stool, remove one leg, and the whole thing collapses.
Yeah.
The framers had witnessed firsthand the dangers of both a weak central government and the potential for tyranny. They were trying to find that sweet spot. A government strong enough to function, but not so strong, it could become oppressive.
Seems like they had a tough task ahead of them. But before we move on, I think it's fair to acknowledge that the Articles weren't all doom and gloom.
That's a good point. They did serve as a crucial transition government, providing a framework during the chaotic years after the Revolutionary War. They acted as a stepping stone to the Constitution.
Okay, so not a complete failure. What were some of their accomplishments?
Well, they achieved some significant things like the Land Ordinance of 1785 and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787.
Okay.
These were instrumental in opening up Western territories for settlement and establishing a system for governing those territories.
So even amidst the failures, there were seeds of success. The Articles laid the groundwork for westward expansion, which would shape the future of the United States. But tell me, what do you find most fascinating about this period?
You know, the Articles, despite their numerous flaws, actually gave us the name United States of America. It symbolizes the idea that these 13 independent colonies were now united under a common banner.
That's an incredible detail. Yeah. Even though the system under the Articles ultimately failed, it demonstrated that a peaceful transition of power was possible.
Absolutely.
What an important lesson.
It is. The Articles were a bold experiment in self-governance. They didn't achieve all their goals, but they paved the way for a more successful and enduring system.
Welcome back to the deep dive. It's incredible how much we can learn from what didn't work in the past.
It's true. Sometimes those epic fail moments teach us more than the perfect successes. In the case of the Articles of Confederation, those mistakes were crucial in shaping the principles enshrined in our Constitution.
Okay, let's break it down. We've talked about popular sovereignty, representative democracy, limited government, checks and balances, separation of powers. It's a lot to unpack.
It is, but each of these concepts is vital to building a stable and just government.
Right.
Let's start with popular sovereignty. This means the people are the ultimate source of power.
Right, but that principle was largely absent at the national level under the Articles, wasn't it?
Exactly. The states held most of the power, and even within the states, voting rights were often restricted. But the Constitution flipped the script, placing power firmly in the hands of the people through representative democracy.
So, the Constitution took the idea of popular sovereignty and put it into action. Citizens could directly influence their government by electing representatives to make decisions on their behalf.
Precisely. This was a radical shift from the systems of government in most of the world at that time. It gave you more power as a citizen. Instead of your voice being limited to your state legislature, you now had a direct say through your elected representatives in Congress.
That's a huge difference. What about the concept of limited government? I know the colonists were wary of centralized power after their experience with British rule.
Absolutely. They were deeply concerned about tyranny. This led them to establish a system where the government's powers were clearly defined and restricted.
Okay.
But as we saw with the Articles, limiting the powers of the national government too much can also be a problem.
That's interesting. So it seems they had to walk a fine line with the Constitution. They needed to limit government power, but not to the point of making it ineffective.
You've hit the nail on the head. That's where checks and balances and separation of powers come into play.
Right, we talked about this earlier. Can you remind us how they work?
Of course. The idea is to divide governmental power among different branches and give each branch the ability to check the powers of the others. It's not just about separating powers, it's about ensuring no single branch can dominate.
So like with Congress, they can pass laws, but the president can veto those laws.
Right.
And Congress can override a veto with a 2/3 majority vote.
Exactly.
There's a constant push and pull to prevent any one person or group from gaining too much control.
Precisely. And let's not forget the crucial role of the judicial branch, the courts. They can interpret laws and even strike down those they deem unconstitutional.
Wow, so even if a law passes through Congress and gets the president's signature, the courts can still step in and say, hold on, that's not allowed. It's like a safety net against potential abuses of power.
Exactly. That power of judicial review safeguards against tyranny and ensures the government always operates within the boundaries set by the Constitution. So we've got these core principles: popular sovereignty, representative democracy, limited government, checks and balances, and separation of powers.
Right.
The framers took the lessons learned from the failures of the Articles and created this incredible blueprint for a new kind of government.
It's amazing how they transformed those founding failures into the foundation of our current system. But let's be honest, the Constitution wasn't perfect from the start, was it?
Of course not. The framers were products of their time. There were compromises and debates, and some issues weren't adequately addressed.
Like the issue of slavery. They knew it was morally wrong, but couldn't agree on how to abolish it without tearing the nation apart.
Unfortunately, that's true, and that failure had devastating and long-lasting consequences.
Right.
It's crucial to remember that the Constitution, despite its brilliance, reflects the complexities and imperfections of its era.
That's a great point. Studying history helps us understand the context in which these documents were created, the challenges faced, and the compromises made. It reminds us that history is not just dates and facts, but a story about people, their struggles, and the enduring impact of their decisions.
Exactly. The Articles of Confederation offer a perfect example of this. We see both failure and triumph in its legacy.
Failure in the sense that the system didn't work.
But also triumph in that those failures paved the way for something better, more resilient. The Constitution.
We've covered so much ground today, from the shaky foundations of the Articles of Confederation to the enduring principles of the Constitution.
Right.
It's been quite a journey. But I'm curious, what stands out to you as the most significant lesson we can learn from this era?
That's a thought-provoking question. For me, it's the importance of constantly evaluating and adapting our systems. The articles showed us what happens when a government lacks the power to address essential issues. But their failure also inspired a remarkable innovation, the Constitution, a document that has adapted and evolved over centuries.
That's a great point. The Constitution wasn't meant to be a static document set in stone.
Yeah.
It's been amended 27 times since its ratification in 1788.
Right. Those amendments reflect the changing values and priorities of the American people over time. They embody the spirit of experimentation and adaptation that continues to shape American democracy. The framers were willing to try something new, to experiment, and when it didn't work, to learn from those mistakes and create something better.
We're back for the final part of our deep dive into the Articles of Confederation. And, I think we've reached a point where we can zoom out and see this story in a bigger context.
I agree. We've examined the Articles' failures, the missing principles, how those shortcomings led to the Constitution, and how the Constitution, while groundbreaking, also had its limitations.
Right.
This brings us to a crucial question. How do we evaluate the legacy of something like the Articles of Confederation?
It's a good question. It wasn't a complete disaster, but it clearly wasn't a success either. It seems like it was more of a necessary stepping stone.
Exactly. The Articles were an experiment, and while they didn't achieve all their goals, they were absolutely essential. Their failures illuminated the path to something better.
So maybe the real lesson here isn't about the specifics of the Articles themselves, but about the vital role of experimentation and adaptation in governing.
I think you've nailed it. The framers were incredibly bold. They tried something completely new, a system of government unlike anything that had existed before.
Right.
And when that system proved inadequate, they were willing to learn from their mistakes and create something new.
And that process of adaptation hasn't stopped, right? We're constantly reevaluating our laws, our institutions, our systems of government as new challenges and changing circumstances arise.
Absolutely. The Constitution itself has been amended 27 times since 1788.
Which shows that it's a living document. Those amendments reflect the evolving values and priorities of the American people over time.
Exactly. The legacy of the Articles of Confederation lives on in that enduring spirit of experimentation and adaptation. It's a spirit that continues to shape American democracy.
That's such an insightful way to look at it. It's not just about the document itself, but about the ongoing process of trying, failing, and trying again. What other founding failures throughout history come to mind that paved the way for progress? What can you, our listener, think of?
That's a fantastic question to ponder. I'm sure our listeners can come up with numerous examples both within the United States and globally.
History is full of them. Progress isn't always a straight line. It's often a messy, iterative process, full of setbacks and course corrections.
That's the beauty of it. As long as we're willing to learn from those setbacks, to adapt, and to keep striving for a more just and equitable society, we're on the right track.
Beautifully said. We've explored the fascinating story of the Articles of Confederation, a tale of both failure and triumph. What will you take away from this deep dive? Thank you so much for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.
And remember, keep those brains buzzing. Keep exploring history and keep asking those big questions. Until next time, happy diving.